Hidden worth a complete three-part script. Cast randomize. Seed 432639. Stellan Fairbrook, CEO 52. White male, Whitfield. Hadley attorney slash villain. 58, white male, Vivian Osborne, strategic advisor slash fiance. 38, white female, Kingsley. Kimball, elder board member, 71. White male, Keisha. Underwood, executive floor cleaner. 44, black female, Kiara. Underwood. Her daughter, 9. Black female, Bernard Fairbrook. Deceased founder. Stellan's father. Viveka Golightly, retired. P, a 68. White female, Wasu. Douglas Hollis. Outside counsel, Glenn Burkett. Floor supervisor, falsified signature. Company, Gentry Industries. Partner firm, Cerex Capital. Part 1. The hand that stopped a billion-dollar deal belonged to a 9-year-old girl in a faded red dress. Stellan Fairbrook had felt the grip before he understood it. Small fingers, surprisingly firm, wrapping around his wrist, just as the pen descended toward the signature line. He looked down. The girl was staring not at him, but at the contract, her eyes steady and certain in a way that children's eyes rarely were. "The last page isn't the same one," she whispered. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Rain tapped against the glass walls of the boardroom, 82 floors above the city. Somewhere far below, Manhattan glittered through silver mist, indifferent to what was happening in this polished room. Then Whitfield Hadley went pale. 3 hours earlier, the evening had begun the way all important evenings began at Gentry Industries, with perfect order. The boardroom smelled of fresh coffee and leather. Crystal water glasses stood untouched beside legal folders embossed with the company seal. A massive digital screen displayed acquisition projections so detailed they seemed to breathe. Recessed lighting softened every edge in the room, the way expensive things always seem to soften everything around them. Stellan arrived 7 minutes early, as he always did. He moved through the door, set his phone face down on the table, and surveyed the room with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 2 decades making decisions that moved markets. At 52, he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had been through enough to understand that visible panic only made things worse. But tonight something felt off. He noticed it first as a smell unfamiliar cologne. Heavier than the ventilation system could quite dissolve, concentrated near the far end of the table where Whitfield typically sat. He noticed it second as a quiet. The boardroom was empty, but the leather folder in front of Whitfield's chair was already open. Someone had been here before him. Stellan glanced at the folder, then away. He dismissed it. Over the last 18 months, he had learned to dismiss many things. His father, Bernard Fairbrook, had died 20 months ago. The grief was not sharp anymore. It had settled into a kind of permanent weight that Stellan carried without acknowledging. The man who had built Gentry Industries from a regional logistics company into an international force had simply one morning stopped waking up. Heart failure. 68 years old. Nobody had seen it coming, least of all Stellan. Since then, the company had kept moving, the way large things kept moving even after the force behind them disappeared. Advisors filled his calendar. Investors filled his inbox. Board members filled his evenings. And through all of it, Whitfield Hadley remained the constant, reliable articulate, always 3 steps ahead of any legal complication, always ready with the appropriate word at the appropriate moment. Stellan trusted him the way a man trusted the floor beneath his feet, without thinking about it, because thinking about it would have been exhausting and probably pointless. He did not know yet how wrong that trust had been. 40 minutes before the board meeting began, in a corridor that smelled of bleach and aged pipe fitting, 9-year-old Kiara Underwood was running her thumb along the edge of a piece of paper she had folded 4 times and tucked into the front pocket of her canvas bag. She had found it an hour earlier. It was not supposed to exist. The cleaning team on the executive floors emptied wastebaskets twice each evening, once at 7:30 and once at 9. Kiara had arrived on the service level at 8:50, waiting for her mother, when she noticed that the bin outside the executive copy room had not been properly emptied. The bag had been pulled, but the bin itself held one last piece of paper stuck to the plastic bottom by a ring of moisture from a coffee cup placed carelessly on top of it. Kiara had almost left it. Then she had picked it up because her father had always said the things that stick around after everyone else leaves are usually the things worth reading. Her father had died when she was 2 years old. She did not remember his face, but she remembered the things her mother repeated about him, the way parents kept people alive through careful repetition. He had been an engineer. He had kept notebooks. He had believed that the gap between what people said and what they actually wrote down was where the truth lived. Kiara had inherited his instinct without inheriting his profession. She read the paper. Three words written in blue ink in the lower right corner, partially obscured by the fold but unmistakable, replaced page 37. She read them twice. Then she folded the paper smaller and put it in her bag. It was the kind of sentence that only made sense if there was something wrong with page 37 in the first place. Keisha Underwood had been working in the executive tower for 21 years. She had started as a junior cleaner at 23 the year Kiara's father was still alive, the year the company had still occupied only 40 floors of the building. She had worked her way through every section: lobby maintenance, conference room, upkeep, executive-level cleaning, archive, floor sanitation. Every performance review in those 21 years described the same woman thoroughly, invisible in the best possible way, someone who understood that the point of her job was to make every space look exactly as it had before she arrived. Keisha labeled everything. It was not a quirk. It was a philosophy. She had grown up in a household where things disappeared. Borrowed without asking, misplaced without apology. Her mother's scissors, her father's good coat, the spare key to the shed. She had decided in early that if you wanted something to remain yours, you put your name on it clearly enough that it became impossible to pretend you had not taken it. Her access card had a small yellow sticker on the back. Black marker, 2 letters, KU. That night at 9:12, Keisha's card was scanned at the service entrance to Level B, one time-stamped and logged by the building's security system. She was pushing her cleaning cart through the basement corridor, heading toward the laundry intake. The cart carried 2 full bags, 4 folded towels, and her thermos of decaf coffee. Her card was still clipped to her belt, yellow sticker, facing outward the way it always was. This was the detail that would matter. At 8:47 that evening, 43 minutes before anyone arrived in the boardroom, a disciplinary suspension notice had been logged into Gentry Industries' human resources system. The employee named was Keisha Underwood. The violation listed was unauthorized access to a restricted level. The approving signature was Whitfield Hadley. Keisha did not know this yet. Kiara did not know this yet. But Stellan Fairbrook would know it before the night was over. The board members arrived in 2s and 3s. Handshakes, quiet conversation, the familiar rhythm of expensive suits and careful sentences. Stellan greeted each of them without remembering what he said. His mind kept returning to the feeling that had settled in his chest since he arrived at Cologne. The open folder, the sense that the room had been arranged rather than simply prepared. Vivian Osborne arrived last, as she usually did. She was 38, elegant in a way that seemed effortless, and was not carrying herself with the particular confidence of someone who had learned early that a room paid attention to whoever appeared to already know how the evening would end. She rested her hand lightly on Stellan's arm as she took her seat beside him. He noticed that she did not look at the contract on the table. Instead, she looked at Whitfield. The meeting began at 9 o'clock precisely. Whitfield walked the board through the acquisition summary, Cerex Capital's offer for a data-sharing partnership valued at $3.2 billion over 7 years. The numbers were strong. The projections were compelling. The contract had been reviewed and approved in its previous 3 iterations without incident. Tonight was the final execution. Everything sounded reasonable. That was becoming a problem. 40 floors below, Kiara was alone in the employee break room, sitting on a plastic chair beside a folding table, her canvas bag in her lap. She had tried calling her mother's cell phone twice. Both times it went to voicemail. At 9:18, a message arrived from her mother's number. 3 words: "Go home, baby." Kiara stared at the message for a long time. Her mother never texted her from work. Company policy prohibited personal cell phones during cleaning shifts. She had said so herself many times with the particular firmness she used for rules she considered worth keeping. And her mother never wrote baby without a period at the end. Punctuation was non-negotiable in their household. Even love needed to be neat. Kiara set the phone face up on the table and looked at the sender details. Somewhere in the settings she had explored once out of curiosity, there was an indicator for device activity. She found it. A second device had accessed her mother's account 31 minutes earlier, at 8:47. 8:47 was exactly when her mother's suspension notice had been logged into the HR system, though Kiara did not yet know this. What she knew was simpler and more immediate. Her mother had not sent that message. She put the phone away. Then she stood up, picked up her canvas bag, and walked toward the freight elevator. In the break room behind her, the folding table held a paper cup of decaf coffee her mother had left behind, still faintly warm at the rim. The freight elevator rose slowly, groaning through the building's bones. Kiara held the canvas bag against her chest and watched the floor numbers climb. She was not supposed to be on the executive levels. She understood this clearly, the way children who grew up in proximity to power understood many things clearly: what spaces they were permitted to occupy, what voices carried authority, and how quickly a person could be relocated without anyone raising their voice. But she was also carrying a piece of paper with 3 words on it. And somewhere in this building, 82 floors up, a man was about to sign something she was not sure was what it claimed to be. On floor 40, she got off and checked the storage room where her mother sometimes left her cart during breaks. The cart was there, and clipped to the side of the supply caddy, exactly where Keisha always kept it, was her access card. Yellow sticker, KU in black marker. Unmistakably the original. Kiara unclipped it, carefully wrapped it in a paper towel from the cart, and put it in her bag. A duplicate had been made. She did not know who had made it or when, but someone had used a copy of her mother's card on the executive floor at 947 after the original was scanned at the basement level at 912. Same card number, different card, one with a sticker, one without. Kiara got back in the elevator. Upstairs, Stellan Fairbrook was looking at the contract with a feeling he could not name. Whitfield had just finished explaining the final authorization clause when Stellan noticed it, the footer at the bottom of page 37. Small, easy to miss, but Stellan had reviewed every version of this document over the past 3 weeks. He knew the formatting, he knew the pagination system, and the footer on page 37 read, Draft V12, not V15, not the final approved version. Version 12. He raised his hand slightly, not dramatically, just enough to pause the room. Bring up the original draft, he said, the one sent to my office this afternoon. The room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Whitfield's smile held. We're already past that stage. Opening earlier versions mid-execution can create confusion. His voice carried the exact calibration of a man who had spent decades making things sound like common sense. The safest move is to complete the process tonight and archive everything properly afterward. Stellan looked at him. Whitfield looked back. Under the table without drawing attention, Stellan slid his phone from his pocket and took a photograph of page 37. He was not sure why he did it. The action felt almost automatic, the way reaching for something when you are not yet sure why you want it often felt. Across the table for less than 1 second, Whitfield's eyes moved to the contract, then back to the room. The movement was small enough to dismiss. Stellan did not dismiss it. Then the boardroom door opened and Kiara Underwood walked in. Several heads turned. A security guard moved immediately from his position near the wall. Kiara lifted her canvas bag before anyone reached her. He doesn't want you to open it, she said. She was looking at Stellan when she said it. The room went very still in the particular way rooms went still when something unexpected arrived, not with noise, but with a sudden collective reassessment of what was happening. Whitfield recovered first. Security, as he said quietly, precisely, remove her. Kiara did not step back. Her worn sneakers left 2 faint damp marks on the carpet. She looked at Stellan directly and said, ask him why the key card was used twice. Stellan set his pen down. What key card? Kiara's voice was small inside the large room, but it did not waver. My mama's. They said she lost it. She didn't. I saw it on her card at 912, and I have it right here. She reached into her bag and withdrew the access card wrapped in paper towel, set it on the nearest table edge. The yellow sticker caught the light. Whitfield opened his mouth. Children are not reliable witnesses to exact times. Kiara reached into her bag again and produced a small, folded receipt, smooth with the careful flatness of something carried too long. I know the time because I bought her soup at 9:10. The receipt says so. I brought it upstairs to her. She was still on the basement level wearing the card. Stellan took the receipt. Chicken noodle soup, bottled water, 9:10 p.m. basement cafe. His thumb paused over the timestamp. And the second use, he asked. Kiara looked at the contract. 9:47 on this floor after they sent her downstairs. The boardroom held its silence. Outside, rain moved across the glass in long, slow lines. Vivian's phone buzzed once inside her purse. She did not reach for it. Stellan turned to Whitfield, his voice very calm, and asked, How would you know cleaning staff weren't allowed on this floor tonight unless you had personally checked the access logs? Whitfield opened his mouth. He closed it. 1 second passed, then two. In the corner of Whitfield's leather case where the flap had come slightly open when he set it down, a white corner of paper was visible. Small, barely, but printed with a security badge number that matched the one on Kiara's receipt. It disappeared back into the case almost immediately. Stellan memorized the moment without letting his expression change. 20 years. 20 years he had trusted this man with everything his father had built. And in 20 years, that trust had made him very good at one particular thing, believing what Whitfield wanted him to believe. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered what he had not been looking at while he was looking at Whitfield. He set the receipt down on the polished table. He did not pick up the pen. The pen remained where it was, less than an inch from the signature line, while outside the windows, Manhattan continued doing what Manhattan always did, moving forward, without waiting to find out what happened next in any single room. Part 2. The first person to move was Vivian Osborne. She rose from her chair without hurrying, crossed the few feet between her seat and Kiara's position, with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating rooms where presence itself was a form of argument, and placed one hand lightly on the girl's shoulder. The gesture was warm. It was also a wall. "Sweetheart," Vivian said, "I think your mom would want you downstairs right now." Kiara looked at the hand on her shoulder. Then she stepped backward just enough to break the contact and said nothing. Vivian's expression did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. In 10 years of corporate negotiations, she had rarely encountered a 9-year-old who understood the geometry of a room. This one did. Around the table, the board members exhaled collectively. The situation had seemed threatening for a moment, and now it seemed handled. Vivian Osborne was good at making things seem handled. Kingsley Kimball, seated fourth from the end, with his reading glasses still perched on the top of his head, was the only one who did not relax. At 71, Kingsley had outlasted 4 CEOs and 2 major restructurings at Gentry Industries. He had also known Bernard Fairbrook for 30 years, which meant he had known Whitfield Hadley for almost as long. He watched the attorney's hands on the leather case and thought a man with nothing to hide does not hold things that carefully. Stellan looked between Kiara and the receipt and the access card wrapped in paper towel and said with a quietness that the room had to lean toward to hear, "I'd like to see the original draft." Whitfield's smooth reply came immediately. "I've already explained the procedural difficulty with that." "You explained why it was inconvenient," Stellan said. "I'm asking you to do it anyway." The distinction was small, the effect was not. One of the junior board members shifted in his chair. Another turned a pen over in his fingers twice, then stopped. These were men and women who had spent careers reading the temperature of a room, and the temperature had just changed. Vivian tried a different approach. She looked directly at Stellan, her voice carrying the particular intimacy of 2 people who were supposed to know each other better than anyone else in the room. "You're letting a 9-year-old with a grocery receipt derail a $3 billion transaction. I need you to hear how that sounds." Stellan heard how it sounded. He also heard what it was not saying. "Kingsley," he said, turning toward the older man, "when you reviewed the acquisition draft 3 weeks ago, how many pages did your copy contain?" Kingsley did not hesitate. 42. I read every one at my desk. I even made a note at the bottom of page 41 because I wanted to revisit the indemnity language." He paused. "I have the note if that's useful." Several board members looked at each other. Whitfield had set both hands flat on the table. Version changes occur throughout the review process. This is standard practice in any complex acquisition. The board approved the substance of the agreement, not the pagination. "Approved substance doesn't change page count," Kingsley said quietly. The room went still. Kiara had remained exactly where she stood, bag over one shoulder, watching the exchange with the concentrated attention of someone who had learned early that adults revealed themselves most clearly when they thought a child had stopped paying attention. She watched Whitfield's hands. She watched Vivian's eyes. And she watched the gap between what each of them said and what their bodies did in the half-second before they said it. She reached into her canvas bag. "I brought something else," she said. Whitfield's eyes moved to the bag before she had finished the sentence. The movement was fast and involuntary, and if you were watching for it, unmistakable. Stellan was watching. Kiara produced the printing confirmation report, a single page worn at the corners, stained with a faint coffee ring that made it look discarded because it had been. She walked around the edge of the table and placed it directly in front of Stellan. He unfolded it, read it once, read it again. Original document, 42 pages. Final printed document, 43 pages. One additional page. He set it down carefully. The memory surfaced without effort 3 weeks earlier, a late conference call about the acquisition timeline. Someone had made a joke about document length. Stellan had said 42 pages is still too many, and Whitfield had laughed, and Vivian had laughed, and it had been the kind of easy moment that made you believe everyone in the room was on the same side. 42 pages. He looked at the contract in front of him. He looked at the printing report. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood up. "We'll take a recess," he said. 10 minutes. Nobody leaves the floor. The instruction was delivered in the same tone as the rest of the evening, measured unraised. But people obeyed it the way they obeyed things said by someone who had stopped performing authority and started simply using it. The boardroom emptied. Stellan walked to the windows. Rain dragged itself across Manhattan in long silver curtains. Vivian came up beside him. "You're doing this because you're grieving. You've been looking for something to be wrong since your father died." Her voice was gentler than any of her boardroom sentences. "Whitfield has protected this company for 20 years. One confused child and a coffee-stained receipt are not a reason to blow up a $3 billion deal." Stellan looked at the city. "The receipt isn't what's bothering me." "Then what is?" He turned toward her. "The printing report is dated 41 hours ago, after the board approved the final version. After your review sign-off, after mine." He paused. "Who was using the executive printer at 11:14 p.m. 2 nights ago?" Vivian looked at him steadily. "Documents get reprinted for binding for distribution. The user ID on the report," Stellan said, "is WH-legal-0047. A silence arrived between them that felt different from the silences that had come before it. Vivian looked away first, just for a second toward the door where Whitfield had exited, just long enough. Stellan went to the smaller conference room adjacent to the boardroom and called Douglas Hollis. The call was brief, and its conclusion was worse than he had expected under New York state law. A contract executed by a CEO with full signatory authority was binding. Even if internal review processes had been circumvented, provided no fraud could be demonstrated in the moment of execution itself. Which meant that once Stellan signed, the altered page carried the same legal weight as the 41 that preceded it. The window to undo it without years of litigation was exactly the width of the moment before the pen touched paper. He ended the call and sat for a moment in a quiet room. His father's voice came to him unbidden, the way his father's voice often came in moments that required a clarity Stellan felt he was failing to find on his own. The most dangerous lies are the ones that have been kept warm by someone you trust. Bernard Fairbrook had said that once during a fishing trip when Stellan was 17, referring to a business partner who had eventually cost the company 4 years and a great deal of money. At the time, Stellan had thought it was an old man being philosophical. He understood now that it was a warning delivered in advance of an occasion his father hoped would never come. He returned to the boardroom. The board was reassembling. Whitfield stood near the presentation screen, speaking quietly with 2 members, whose expressions suggested they had been encouraged to feel that the evening was nearly back on track. Vivian sat in her chair with the stillness of someone managing a very specific internal calculation. Stellan placed a sealed manila envelope at the center of the table. Nobody asked what was in it. "Before we continue," he said, "I have one question." He looked at Whitfield. "When was Keisha Underwood's access card first reported missing?" Whitfield answered without pause. "Approximately 9:45 p.m. Stellan nodded. He turned to the IT director. "Pull the access logs, please." The request landed differently than it would have 20 minutes earlier. The IT director opened his laptop without comment. The loading sequence appeared on the main screen, and the boardroom waited with the particular quality of waiting that exists when people suspect they already know what is about to be confirmed. The logs loaded. "That's strange," the IT director said. Nobody moved. "The 947 scan on this floor," he continued, pointing at the screen, "doesn't include the secondary inventory tag. But the 912 basement scan does. The sticker on the physical card generates a background code in the system." He looked up. These 2 scans belonged to 2 different cards. The silence that followed was not brief. Whitfield opened his mouth. Before he could form a sentence, Kingsley Kimball spoke for the second time that evening. I'd like to formally request that no one leave this floor until we've also reviewed the document version history. His voice carried the measured precision of a man who had spent 50 years choosing when to speak. I've been on this board for 16 years. I've watched 3 acquisitions. I have never seen legal counsel sign a personnel suspension. He set his reading glasses on the table in front of him. Not once. The room shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. Several board members were still processing the access log revelation. Others were watching Whitfield. But the geometry of the table had changed in a way that did not require announcement. The number of people in the room who were still actively helping the evening proceed as planned had quietly become a minority. Then Whitfield did something that changed everything. He opened his leather case and produced a second document. Before this proceeds any further, he said, his voice returning to its practiced smoothness, I think the board should be aware that this is not the first time Keisha Underwood's access record has raised concerns. He distributed several copies around the table. This is an internal HR review compiled over the past 6 months. Multiple unauthorized zone entries, improperly logged cleaning cycles patterns consistent with someone using their access for purposes beyond their role description. The document circulated. Faces changed as people read it. Kiara, who had been sitting quietly near the end of the table, leaned forward slightly. She did not ask to hold a copy. She watched the page in the hands of the person nearest to her and read it from 4 feet away, with the facility of a child who had grown up doing homework in the margins of other people's attention. The signature at the bottom of the HR review belonged to a floor supervisor named Glenn Burkett. Kiara looked at the signature for a long moment. The letters were printed in block capitals. She had seen enough of her mother's paperwork, enough school forms, enough maintenance logs to know that people who sign their name the same way every time rarely switch between print and script without a reason. The body of the document used standard type text throughout, but Glenn Burkett's signature was in block capitals so precise they looked constructed rather than written. She looked at Whitfield. He was watching the board members read. He had not looked at Kiara in the last 4 minutes. That was new. Kingsley Kimball set his copy down and picked up his cell phone. He scrolled through his contacts with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been collecting people's numbers for 5 decades and found Glenn Burkett on the second try. The call lasted 40 seconds. Kingsley set the phone face down on the table. Glenn Burkett says he has never signed anything related to Keisha Underwood. Kingsley's voice was without inflection. He was not aware such a document existed. The room held very still. Whitfield said, memories aren't always. I have him on readout. Kingsley said, if anyone would like to speak with him directly. The document stopped circulating. Stellan looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at the document in front of her. Then Stellan said carefully into the silence, the supplemental clause on page 43. Who proposed adding it? Vivian's head came up. Whitfield said almost simultaneously, that was a routine addition based on state partnership law. I asked who proposed it, Stellan said. Neither of them answered. Stellan waited. He had learned from his father that silence applied correctly was more persuasive than any question. Bernard Fairbrook had been capable of waiting out almost anyone. Stellan was finding tonight that he had inherited more of that capacity than he had realized. Whitfield spoke first. The original proposal came from Vivian's office in the context of the marital asset review she submitted in February. Vivian turned toward Whitfield slowly. Her expression for the first time all evening was not composed. That is not what happened, and you know it. February 8th, Whitfield said, the memo is in the supplemental file. The memo referenced standard estate integration, not a 43-page. Vivian, Whitfield's voice carried a warning so clean it was almost audible as a sound distinct from the words. We discussed this. The room understood. Not every detail, not the mechanics, but the outline was now visible to everyone present the way the shape of a thing could be clear even through dark water. 2 people had known about a page that should not exist. One of them was explaining it. The other was watching the explanation like someone watching a fire spread toward them from an unexpected direction. Stellan laid the flash drive on the table. 3 letters on a white label in black marker WH. He placed the printing confirmation report beside it. Then he reached into his jacket and laid down one more document, Keisha Underwood's suspension notice, bearing a signature that had no business being there. Timestamped 8:47 p.m., 14 minutes before the board meeting began, and 40 minutes before anyone had reported her card missing. Kingsley looked at the suspension notice. He looked at the timestamp. The card was reported missing at 9:45, he said slowly to no one in particular, but the suspension was filed at 8:47. He picked up the document. Based on what was the suspension filed, nobody answered. Kiara spoke from her end of the table. Because she saw them talking, Kiara said, in the records room at 9:05. She paused. She told me when I brought her soup. She said she heard Mr. Hadley and a woman laughing, and it sounded like they knew how the meeting was going to go. She thought it was just about business. Kiara looked at her hands. She didn't know it was about her. Stellan's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the contract. Then the security director's phone rang. He looked at it. Then he looked at Stellan with an expression that had no clear category. Sir, he said Keisha Underwood is not showing in the system as having exited the building. She's not in the basement. She's not responding to the floor pager. He set the phone down carefully. She's still here somewhere, but we have no logged location. Kiara was on her feet before anyone else moved. Her voice did not waver. She didn't leave. She's still here. Whitfield said too quickly, the building has over 80 floors. We cannot possibly. Stellan turned to him. How did you know she'd want to leave? The question arrived in the room like something that had been waiting since 9 o'clock to be asked. Whitfield Hadley, for the first time in an evening built on the architecture of his composure, did not have an answer ready. And in the silence that followed, the floor beneath the evening's careful construction finally quietly gave way. Part 3. The building had 37 stairwells, 11 service corridors, and exactly one place where the sound of the laundry machines on level B3 could be heard from the hallway outside the door beside the secondary water main, which hummed in a lower register on humid evenings and created together with the machines a kind of white noise that Keisha Underwood had found calming for reasons she had never tried to explain to anyone. Kiara knew this because she had sat with her mother in that hallway twice waiting out the last hour of a long shift, doing homework on her tablet, while her mother drank decaf and listened to the mechanical sound with her eyes half closed and her shoulders slowly dropping. Level B3, Kiara said, the laundry corridor. There's no camera. She goes there when she needs to think. Stellan looked at her for 1 second, then turned to the security director. Take her down. 2 people, no announcement over the floor system. Kiara was already moving toward the door. In the boardroom hallway, a few floors above where they were headed, Vivian Osborne was on her phone. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Whatever response she received caused her to stand very still for a moment before she ended it and walked without hurrying toward the elevator bank. She did not see Kiara until she was already in the stairwell corridor. The security director was a few steps behind. Kiara had moved faster than expected. Vivian stopped. She looked at the girl in the faded red dress with the canvas bag standing in the fluorescent light of a stairwell that smelled of concrete and old pipe fitting, and made a decision that people in her position sometimes made when they believed they were alone. She said what she actually meant. She crouched down to Kiara's level. Her voice was quiet, and there was something in it that might have been desperation wearing the clothes of reason. I can make your mother's suspension permanent, Vivian said, or I can make it disappear entirely. HR does what the board directs. That's how this building works. She held Kiara's gaze. You're 9 years old. You don't have to carry this. Go downstairs, find your mother, and I will personally make sure she walks back into her job Monday morning like none of this happened. Kiara looked at her for a long moment. You already made your choice tonight, Kiara said. Vivian blinked. It was not the response she had prepared for. You made it when you helped put the wrong page in that contract, Kiara continued. And when you let Mr. Hadley sign my mama's name on something she didn't know about. And when someone sent me a message from her phone that wasn't her. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder. Those choices are already done. You can't trade them now. Vivian opened her mouth. The security director appeared at the end of the corridor. Vivian straightened up, adjusted her jacket, and walked past them both without another word. The sound of her heels on the concrete diminished and disappeared. Kiara found her mother exactly where she had said she would be. Keisha Underwood was sitting on an overturned supply crate in the B3 laundry corridor, her cleaning uniform pressed and clean as always, her thermos of decaf in her hands. She was not panicking. She did not know yet that she had been suspended, that her access card had been duplicated, or that her daughter had just spent the past 90 minutes in an 82nd floor boardroom holding a $3 billion contract in place with a grocery receipt in a worn canvas bag. She looked up when Kiara appeared in the doorway. "Baby," she said, immediately standing, "you were supposed to go home." "I know," Kiara said. Keisha opened her arms and Kiara walked into them and stayed there for a moment while the machines ran their cycles and the pipes hummed in the walls. Some truths were easier to absorb inside a hug than outside one. "I need to tell you something," Kiara said into her mother's shoulder. "Is it bad?" Kiara considered. "It's true," she said finally. "That's mostly what it is." Upstairs, Stellan Fairbrook was watching footage from a hallway camera on the executive floor, the one positioned above the clock outside the copy room, recorded on the second evening of its 72-hour overwrite cycle. The security director had pulled it at Stellan's instruction. The boardroom had grown so quiet that the hum of the laptop fan was audible. The footage was grainy. The timestamp was precise. At 9:14 p.m., Keisha Underwood pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway at a pace that matched every other scan in her 21 years of access logs, steady, purposeful, unhurried. Her access card was visible clipped to her belt. The yellow sticker caught the hallway light for exactly 2 frames. At 9:21, Whitfield Hadley entered the hallway from the eastern corridor. He looked left, he looked right. He used a card to enter the copy room. He was inside for 18 minutes. At 9:39, he emerged carrying a thick document stack. His posture was that of a man who had accomplished something and was satisfied with the efficiency of it. At 9:46, he stopped beside Keisha's unattended cleaning cart. He bent forward, lifted a folded cleaning rag, and slid a white access card beneath it. He replaced the rag. He continued walking. The yellow sticker was visible in the footage. KU. The board members watched in a silence so complete that when one of them coughed softly, 3 people flinched. Stellan did not watch Whitfield as the footage ran. He watched the room. He watched the moment when the board's collective understanding of the evening shifted from uncertainty into something that could not be undone by any further explanation. He had been in enough negotiations to know the difference between a room that was still deciding and a room that had decided. This one had decided. Whitfield said nothing. He had stopped producing sentences several minutes ago and had not started again. His hands rested on the leather case with the exact stillness of someone who had run out of things to hold on to and was holding on to the familiar shape of a thing that no longer contained what they needed. Kingsley Kimball was the first board member to speak. "I'd like to formally move that we suspend tonight's execution pending an independent legal review of all contract versions and associated documentation." 4 hands went up before he finished the sentence. Whitfield Hadley reached for his phone. The security director placed one hand on his arm not unkindly and said, "Sir, Mr. Fairbrook asked that no one leave the floor until the documentation has been secured." Whitfield looked at Stellan. Stellan looked back at him with an expression that was not anger. It was something older and quieter than anger. It was the face of a man cataloging a loss that had turned out to be larger than the event that revealed it. 20 years, Stellan said. Not as an accusation, almost as a question. Whitfield did not answer. The security team located the memory card in the inner pocket of Whitfield's coat during the documentation process that followed. It was small-scratched and unassuming. On it was a complete copy of the original 42-page acquisition agreement, clean, unaltered version 15, exactly as the board had approved it. The security director handed it to Stellan without comment. Stellan held it for a moment. Then he understood Whitfield had kept the original as insurance, a safeguard for negotiation, for leverage, for the possibility that things went wrong in a way that required a bargaining position. The same careful calculation that had made him useful for 20 years had also made him preserve the evidence of his own fraud. The investigation that followed was not dramatic. It was methodical. Federal involvement came through the standard referral process. The altered contract, the fabricated HR review, the unauthorized duplication of an employee's access credentials, and the undisclosed financial arrangement with Cerex Capital's advisory board constituted a case that prosecutors described as unusually well documented. It was well documented because Whitfield Hadley had been, until the last possible moment, a very careful man. 3 mornings after the boardroom meeting, Stellan called Viveka Golightly. Viveka had been his father's personal assistant for 14 years, before retiring at 62, 6 months before Bernard Fairbrook died. She was now 68 and lived in Connecticut and baked bread on Thursdays and had, in Stellan's memory, never once failed to tell the truth when asked directly. He asked her about the envelope. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I wondered when you'd call about that." The envelope had been in her home safe for 11 months, sealed unremarkable, labeled only with Stellan's first name in Bernard's handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper handwritten on his father's personal stationery, dated 3 weeks before his death. Bernard Fairbrook had not been a sentimental letter writer. The note was 4 sentences. Whitfield is a careful man. Careful men are useful until they have something to protect. I hope you never need this, but if you do, check the Xerox Capital Advisory Board list. Third name from the bottom. Stellan sat at his desk for a long time after reading it. Then he pulled up the Xerox Capital Governance filing. Advisory Board. He scrolled to the bottom. He counted up from the last entry. Third from the bottom, W.C. Hadley. Advisory capacity. Listed since 2019. His father had known. Not everything. Not the timeline. Not the specific mechanism of the fraud. But he had known the shape of it, a trusted man with a private financial stake in an outcome he was supposed to be protecting against. Bernard Fairbrook had gathered one piece of verifiable fact, put it in an envelope, and trusted that his son would eventually be in a position to know what to do with it. Stellan set the paper down and sat in his office with the lights off for 20 minutes. He was thinking about the specific texture of trust that comes from years of proximity, the way it accumulates invisibly, the way it becomes the reason you stop checking, the way it is most dangerous precisely at the moment when it feels most earned. He was thinking about Keisha Underwood's suspension notice, which he had signed without reading because Whitfield had told him it was routine. He was thinking about how 21 years of clean performance reviews could be erased in 30 seconds by a man whose word he had stopped questioning long ago. He was thinking about Kiara in her faded dress holding a coffee-stained receipt, standing in a room where everything about her suggested she should not have been taken seriously. She had been right. He had been the one who needed catching up. The meeting that Stellan convened 3 weeks later was not announced in advance as anything particular. The invitation went to every department, every level, every floor. Executives received it in their formal email. Maintenance staff received it on the internal posting boards. It said simply, "All hands assembly, main auditorium, Wednesday at 10. The room seated 1,200 people. It was full. Stellan walked to the front without notes. He stood at the microphone for a moment before he spoke, looking at the room, the way you looked at something you had owned for years without properly seeing the front rows in their tailored suits, the back rows in their work uniforms, the people in between who represented all the gradations of a company that had grown large enough to forget sometimes that it was made of people. For 21 years, he said, Keisha Underwood worked in this company with integrity. The auditorium was quiet. When she was accused of a violation she did not commit, I signed her suspension notice in under a minute. He paused. I did not read it closely. I did not ask for supporting documentation. I signed it because the person who put it in front of me was someone I had trusted for 20 years. That failure belongs to me. In the third row from the back, Keisha Underwood sat between two accounting clerks she did not know well and a receptionist she had spoken to in the elevator twice a year for a decade. She lowered her eyes when Stellan said her name. She did not look up again until he finished speaking. A company is not judged by how it treats the people whose names are on the building, he said. It is judged by how it treats the people whose names are on nothing at all. The applause started in the back rows. Keisha's record was cleared that afternoon formally and completely, with a written correction entered into the permanent HR archive. Her position was restored with full back pay. She was offered a supervisory role that had been discussed in her performance reviews for 4 consecutive years and never formalized. She accepted it on the condition that she could keep her current hours because Kiara's school schedule did not change on account of corporate restructuring. Kingsley Kimball drafted the governance amendment himself, a 3-person review requirement for any disciplinary action originating outside the direct chain of HR authority with a mandatory 48-hour hold before execution. He submitted it the following Tuesday. The board passed it unanimously at the next regular session. Vivian Osborne had resigned before the board could act on her involvement. The resignation was delivered in writing at 3 in the morning, 2 days after the boardroom meeting. It was brief and contained no admission of knowledge or intent. Stellan met with her once in a conference room with no one else present. He said, I think you knew. Vivian looked at the table, then she looked up and said, I thought it was just the asset clause. I didn't know about Xerox. I didn't know about her card. A long pause. I knew something was off with page 43. I told myself it was standard. Stellan nodded once. There was nothing else to say that would have made either of them feel better, and neither of them tried. The engagement ended the way some things ended, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, permanent withdrawal of something that had been present and was now not. 6 months later, a money order arrived at the administrative office of the Gentry Industries Employee Scholarship Fund. It was issued anonymously in the amount that would cover a full year of the fund's operational costs. The issuing account traced to a financial intermediary that did not track its clients' identities. The memo line was blank. Stellan did not know with certainty where it came from. He had his suspicion. He filed it with everything else that had no clean resolution. The scholarship fund had been his idea formalized on a Tuesday afternoon in October. It was named without fanfare, a number, and a year because Stellan had decided that naming things after yourself was a habit he was trying to break. It provided educational support for children of Gentry Industries employees, with priority given to families who had experienced internal HR disputes. The first recipient was a 14-year-old in Queens whose mother worked in document services and had spent 3 months on unpaid leave over a payroll dispute that turned out to be an administrative error. Kiara found out about the scholarship 2 days after Stellan announced it via a notice posted on the employee communication board in the B1 break room. She read it once, then went back to her homework. That evening, she wrote one sentence in her notes application. He listened. She had been keeping the application since she was 6 at her mother's suggestion after she discovered her late father's last notebook in a box under Keisha's bed. Most of the entries were small. Time observations, questions she had not known how to ask, things she saw that adults seemed not to notice. That entry was the shortest one she had ever written. It was also the one she went back to most often afterward. Autumn settled over the city in the way New York autumns did, abruptly, without ceremony, as if the trees had been waiting for permission and finally received it all at once. The air turned dry and cold. The morning light changed angles. On a Thursday evening in early November, Stellan drove himself to the address he had confirmed 3 times, parked at the curb, and sat in the car for a moment before going in. It was a narrow townhouse on a quiet block in a neighborhood that had neither the anxiety of poverty nor the pretension of money. The windows were lit from inside. Through the front curtain, he could see the warm glow of a kitchen lamp. Keisha opened the door before he reached it. She had heard the car. "Mr. Fairbrook." She stood aside to let him in. The kitchen smelled of chicken soup and bread. A small television played muted news in the adjacent room. Kiara sat at the table under a lamp, bent over a worksheet, pencil in hand, working through something with the focused quiet of a child who had learned to use whatever space was available. "Sit down," Keisha said. It was not quite an instruction. It was the natural grammar of someone in their own home. Stellan sat. Keisha ladled soup without asking if he wanted any. He accepted the bowl without protest. They talked for a while about things that had nothing to do with the boardroom. The scholarship fund's first intake, Keisha's new supervisory responsibilities, the particular difficulties of managing a cleaning schedule across 30 floors when 3 team members were out sick. Kiara worked through her homework without looking up. At some point, Stellan's eyes moved to the shelf beside the window. 2 things rested there. The worn canvas bag, handle slightly frayed, sitting exactly as a thing sits when it has been placed with purpose rather than convenience. And beside it, in a simple dark frame that looked like it had come from a drugstore, the printing confirmation report, original document 42 pages. Final printed document 43 pages. Pressed flat under glass, mounted on a small square of white cardstock. "Your mother wanted to throw it away," he said. Kiara looked up from her homework. "I told her no." "Why?" She thought about it the way she thought about most things, briefly and without performance. "Because that's the paper everybody ignored." She tapped her pencil against the edge of the table once lightly. "The important ones usually look like that." Stellan looked at the framed report for a moment. 43 pages, one too many. The gap between what a document claimed to be and what it actually was, preserved under glass on a kitchen shelf by a 9-year-old in a faded red dress. He thought about his father's envelope sitting in Viveka Golightly's safe for 11 months. He thought about Keisha's access card with the yellow sticker carried for 21 years through every corridor of a building that had not known her name. He thought about the freight elevator, the coffee receipt, the scratched flash drive left behind in a service room. All of it had been there. All of it had been visible to anyone who looked. He said, "Your father kept notebooks." Kiara looked at him steadily. "Mama told you." She mentioned it. Kiara set her pencil down. He said the gap between what people say and what they write down is where the truth is. She picked up the pencil again. I think about that a lot. Keisha came back to the table with bread and set it between them without ceremony. Outside, rain had begun again, tapping lightly at the kitchen window, running in thin lines down the glass. It was an ordinary evening. Stellan had spent the past 30 years in rooms where extraordinary things happened. Billion-dollar decisions, market-moving announcements, the kind of moments that appeared in newspapers the following morning. He had grown accustomed to measuring the significance of an evening by its scale. He understood now that he had been measuring wrong. The most important thing that had happened in the last 3 months was a 9-year-old girl deciding that truth was worth carrying into a room where nobody expected to find it. Everything else, the investigation, the amendments, the resignation, the fun had followed from that one decision. All of it downstream from a child who had found a wet piece of paper in a trash can and refused to put it back. Kiara finished her worksheet, capped her pencil, and closed the folder. People tell the truth all the time, she said to no one in particular, in the way children sometimes said the things they had been turning over for a long while. They just need someone to listen. The rain tapped at the glass. Keisha brought 3 cups to the table, set them down quietly, and sat. Stellan looked at the framed report on the shelf, at the canvas bag beside it, at the lamp's warm circle on the tablecloth. He had spent 18 months learning how to grieve his father. He was still learning. But he understood something tonight that he had not found the language for until now. The lesson his father had spent 30 years trying to teach him was not about business at all. It was about which rooms you chose to enter, which voices you chose to hear, and whether you could recognize a person's worth when they arrived without anything to prove it except the truth they were carrying. He had almost missed it. He thought he would spend a considerable part of the rest of his life making sure he did not miss it again. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the kitchen held its warmth.